With WWE's Evolution 2 happening this weekend, it should be worrying to note that they've only sold about half of the tickets that they sold for the first Evolution, at least as of the last time I checked. And with this being said, we almost have to ask what exactly happened on the way to the Women's Revolution, and what exactly went wrong, as this particular event has a lot riding on it, so much so that we have to talk about it as the topic of this episode. Because today, fans online are always talking about how much they want more women's wrestling and they want things to be better for women's wrestlers. And while I do think that's genuine, the only issue is you don't really see them putting their money where their mouth is. And let's be clear about something. Thousands of people willing to pay their money just to see an event live is still a tremendous accomplishment. And while there are a lot of fans out there who are supporting female wrestling with their hard-earned money, it's going to take a lot more than that to keep this evolution going. But that's only if it's supposed to keep going in the first place. The first WWE Evolution pay-per-view was headlined by Ronda Rousey and Nikki Bella, a decision that a lot of people, including myself, were very vocally against. After waiting so long to finally have an all-women's pay-per-view, the newcomer, the part-timer, the horrid Ronda Rousey really didn't deserve that top honor. And as I have pointed out in previous videos, Ronda Rousey isn't a draw, with that original Evolution pay-per-view only scoring about 10,000 tickets, which is less than the original All In. And while that isn't great, it seems that this current pay-per-view is on track to possibly do even worse. But this time around, WWE isn't doing the same thing that they did last time, as now we have full-time veteran wrestlers leading the marquee, with Io Shirai and Rhea Ripley main eventing. And so, while I was very critical of that original main event bout, could it be that WWE might have been right? Or could it be that the current crop, as good as they are, still aren't up to the level that they need to be? And so, as much as female wrestling supporters have supported female wrestling, the question is, has it run its course? Now obviously, I'm not saying let's get rid of female wrestling, that's not even a consideration. But I am wondering, why did 10 years ago feel so different than it does now? It seemed like the first of its kind back then. But maybe that was the problem. When WWE's Women's Revolution all began, it was fun, it was exciting, and it was new. Back in those days, a lot of matches, a lot of pay-per-view cards were sold off of the idea that we were going to get the first female something. The first women to main event a pay-per-view, the first all-female pay-per-view, the first women to main event a WrestleMania. And while recently we did have the first ever Women's Intercontinental and United States Championships, it seems more like something that's just a last-ditch effort rather than something that the fans actively wanted or is going to improve the division, as the Women's United States Championship seems to have zero importance. The point is, this is beginning to feel like when DC Comics keeps resetting their universe so they can sell you a brand new #1 issue. And with just about all the women's first already out the way, and this being the second evolution, we have to ask, can WWE's women's wrestling survive that of the second round? Are we already seeing diminishing returns when it comes to the Women's Revolution? And is it possible that a lot of fans just don't want to give up their money if they can't say they were at the first something? Because bragging about being in second place really isn't all that impressive. Whether folks are conscious of it or not, there is a lot riding on every women's match, as analysts are looking to put the entire idea of female wrestling under a microscope for every single thing. And any lack of financial performance is always going to be seen by an executive as a reason not to keep moving forward with something. And as I've also iterated before, while Vince McMahon is known as the ruthless businessman, he's nowhere near as successful as Endeavor. And if it's taken us 7 years to get another Evolution pay-per-view, if this show doesn't perform well, I wouldn't be surprised if TKO takes even longer, if they ever do another one at all. And so, could it be that with Endeavor, we're jumping out of the Vince McMahon frying pan and directly into the fire? Patreon shout out to the amazing Patreon supporters such as Dakari Garman, Mr. J, Ron Hawthorne, Meiji Stray, Harry Flynn, and to the rest of you awesome Patreons. Thank you so much. Now that we've been under the Triple H regime for quite some time, there are a lot of fans who really enjoy the WWE product way more than they did under Vince. And while certain aspects of the show have improved, women's wrestling is almost undeniably in a worse position somehow, as most of the roster seems to be falling to the background. Maybe not as bad as during the original Saudi shows, but you get my point. When you stop to look at it, under Vince we had not one but two female-led main events for WrestleMania. Now granted, Triple H is still relatively new to this, but we should point out that those two WrestleMania main events that I was just talking about happened at 35 and then 37. And with Hunter now having 3 WrestleManias under his belt, a lack of time really doesn't seem like that much of an excuse. And sure, it did take Vince McMahon 35 years to do it to begin with, but my point is that in this new age, Triple H seemingly is taking a big step backwards, especially when you stop to look at the style of booking that Triple H has been doing for most of the men lately. We're talking heavy character arcs and a lot of really story-based wrestling. Now, I'm not trying to say that Vince McMahon was good at booking female wrestling, but what I am trying to say is that after all the eventual strides that he did make, and he did make some, the ball really hasn't continued. The progress hasn't kept on going, and that's something that's actively been happening under Triple H's watch. And let's just take a look at recent years in WWE and all the storylines we've gotten. Cena turning heel, Roman Reigns and the conclusion of the Tribal Chief storyline. And even if you didn't love any of those or don't think they're great, at least they existed. Name anything in the women's division that even comes close to that. Now, I'm not trying to cast aspersions, especially since I've often talked about how bookers or promoters do have certain areas that they're just not as good at as others. And while I do think Triple H is doing a good job at telling stories at the men's main event level, or at least an adequate job, and he's also pretty good at bringing back Jim Crockett promotion gimmicks, it seems like his focus on women's wrestling isn't exactly where it could be. And this whole thing seems really weird to me, especially when you consider that Ryan Ward, the guy who's behind all the good Triple H booking but doesn't get nearly enough credit, is also the one who's behind all the good stuff that the women's division did in NXT, during the original Black and Gold run. And speaking of which, there are a lot of people who like the women's division in NXT right now, as well as in TNA. But with all of it working on a smaller scale, we have to wonder, is this the limit? Is this the reach of women's wrestling? Are women capable of grossing more? Well, I've already answered that. Now, to reiterate what I previously stated in another video, reducing this equation down to whether or not women's wrestling can draw or not is just too simplistic, as when it comes to men's wrestling, if a main event bout scheduled between two guys doesn't do well financially, we don't say that men's wrestling doesn't draw. We instead talk about the industry as a whole, or we put the focus on the individuals in the match. And we should be doing this for women as well, especially if you take the time to look at WWE's top performers when it comes to merchandise sales, as you will routinely see women on that list. And not just as a fluke, but with some consistency. Rhea Ripley, Alexa Bliss, Liv Morgan, Bianca Belair, Becky Lynch, all of them on a regular basis move a lot of merchandise, making WWE lots of money, with Becky in fact even topping the merchandise sales for the entire company one year. But unfortunately, a lot of little things matter when it comes to business. As did you know, video game covers that have female protagonists on them tend to do worse in sales overall, which is why in the Assassin's Creed game, despite them wanting to have a female protagonist, they almost always have to give you a male option, and that male is usually featured on the box. And believe it or not, this also affects the world of wrestling too, because despite Becky Lynch being the top earner, she still had to share the 2K20 cover with Roman Reigns for this exact same reason. But following that example, is it possible that WWE might just be self-sabotaging and they're booking women's wrestling like this on purpose? Well, some people think so. Okay, since we recently talked about this, we're just gonna cover this real quick. Counter-programming is when a company deliberately schedules an event for the explicit reason of taking views or audience away from another company. And as I already mentioned in a recent video, simply booking a show adjacent to another is not counter-programming, at least not necessarily, as traditionally it's always been a boom for the other show. And not only that, by that logic, WWE would be counter-programming against itself with WrestleMania and SummerSlam both being 2 nights. And so, while there are some who speculate that WWE Saturday Night's main event as well as its NXT show might be drawing audience away from Evolution 2, there's not a lot of evidence to support that, especially considering that Evolution is much cheaper than Saturday Night's main event and it still isn't selling. And furthermore, as of right now, both Saturday Night and Evolution 2 are being sold as a combo. As I say time and time again, we need to start believing more in individuals and less on demographics. If we want things to be equal, then they have to be equal. We have to judge women on the same standards that we judge the men, for better or for worse. And as such, what I think is the biggest problem is that we just don't have the star power that we used to. And I know there are some of you who are getting really mad right now because you're big fans of the current stars of the WWE's women's division. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with them. I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm just saying that they're not quite on the same level as the original horsewomen. And the numbers back that up. When WWE's Women's Revolution started, I have to say there was something special about that first class. And not just because they were there at the beginning, as there were those women who predated them such as Natty, Paige, AJ Lee, who were all there changing the game for women's wrestling in WWE. However, there was something just so captivating about Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, and of course Bayley. And as popular as Rhea Ripley and Asuka are, they just don't have the mojo that those original horsewomen had. But like everything in wrestling, sooner or later we're going to need to switch it up. After 10 years in WWE, of course the division is going to need fresh blood, but it's also going to need wrestlers with the same amount of star power as those original horsewomen. And while a lot of the new crop does have strong merchandise sales, outside of that, there's not much to reflect that they have the same impact. Ultimately, this is a tough call. What exactly is the problem? Is it a lack of support by management? Is it a lack of support by fans? Is it a combination of both? Why is it so vocal and so loud when you listen to the chatter online, but you don't see any of that reflected in the stadiums, in the arenas, and in the overall amount of coverage that the men get? As Dave Chappelle said, what does it really mean to be equal? Should women get 50% of the airtime on Raw, on SmackDown, and pay-per-views that the men get? And if they don't, does this mean that WWE doesn't have any confidence in the women's division? And if that is so, is that warranted? These are the hard questions that we have to ask ourselves. And let's just look at this video. Let's see if it gets the same amount of likes and views as my normal videos do on average. And if it doesn't, maybe it's just coincidence, or maybe there's something to this that we really need to address. Anyway, with that being said, let's find out how good Evolution 2 does this weekend, and let me know down in the comments what you think will help progress for women in WWE. Thank you to all my amazing Patreon supporters, and as always, Dave knows.